So you live in a state where you need an ID to vote. No big deal, right? Unless you can't get off work when the office is open, or don't have a way to get there, or can't pay the fee. You get the idea. I'm Michelle Tyreen Johnson. Welcome to Race Unwrapped. On this episode, we'll talk to Selene Gomez. She's the outreach director of an organization called Vote Riders, which has helped 6 million people get IDs so they can vote. Tell me a little bit about Vote Riders. It's Riders, Riders.
Yes, Vote Riders, which we actually got our name after Freedom Riders. So Vote Riders is a national nonpartisan organization that has been around since 2012. It was actually, a product of seeing that red wave taking over a lot of the state, legislative sessions and passing some of these voter ID laws. And so that is how Vote Riders was created. And so what we focus on is we focus on the voter ID part of the voting process. So we focus on not just creating awareness and educating people about whether or not they need an ID to vote or alternatives of any, but then also actually helping them obtain an acceptable ID. So if somebody needs a state identification and they need underlying documents like a certified copy of their birth certificate, or honestly, sometimes it's just a matter of covering the cost of the actual identification. We are there to help and also to answer any questions, since we do see that unfortunately there's quite a bit of voter confusion going on. People that live in states that have voter ID laws not knowing that they have them, and then even individuals and voters that live in states that do not have voter ID laws thinking that they do.
You know, it's funny. One of the things about your organization that most struck me, which is why I was just really wanting to talk to someone, is because it's one of the most concrete in terms of how you help people. I mean, if people talk about voting generically and even voter suppression generically, but you all get in the middle of everything, and you're like, how do we concretely help people get the voter or the ID they need to properly vote? And that's pretty cool. How many people did you help in just 2023 alone?
In 2023, we reached over 6 million voters, over 6.1 million voters. A lot of them, it was voter confusion. It was a matter of letting them know what they needed. But then there were also voters that actually needed an identification. And so going through that process that could very well take 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, maybe ongoing, right? And so we've been able to reach out. And even though we do this for voting, we also understand that this is a holistic approach, because being able to have a state identification also means that you're able to get employment, you're able to get housing, which is very real for a lot of people in the United States nowadays, right? If we're talking about racial equity, let's give that access to everybody. And part of it is having that identification. Not only that, but we have states like in Texas, for example, where essentially you're being criminalized for not having an identification with you at this point, right? So being able to identify yourself has become more of a necessity. And so it should be treated as such, and we should be able to provide those if that's something that we're asking of everybody. But unfortunately, until we get to that point, Vote Riders is making sure that at least, and especially for the voting process, we're able to help them obtain that, because there is quite a bit of a bureaucratic process to navigate through and to be able to get to that final step of actually having your identification.
I have to admit that when the issue of needing ID for voting came up like years ago, years and years and years ago, I was like, but what's the big deal? Doesn't everybody have identification? And then I realized that I said that with the privilege of someone who has had a driver's license since I was 16 years old. And I just take it for granted that everybody has a driver's license. And even people who, are live in places similar to me don't have driver's license because they don't drive for whatever reason, whether it's they live in a city that has great public transportation or they just don't drive. So how do you explain that to people? How do you explain to people that it is more of an impediment than they think it is?
Yes. In a study that we did recently in 2023, we found, right, that was something that we wanted to find, because initially, when you just kind of look at it, people tend to say, what's the big deal? It's fine. Let's do it. Right. But once you learn about all the intricacies that it involves, that's when you see people taking a step back and realizing, wow, there's a lot of barriers, right? It's not just that end result of having to show your ID, but it's in the beginning of it. I can tell you that from, our work, one of the most impacted individuals or demographics is Native Americans, for example, in Arizona. We've been trying to figure out how it is that we can help in getting them to the ID issuing office when the reservations are 1 to 2 hours one way from the nearest post office, even further from, the nearest town, to be able to do that. Not only that, but recognizing the addresses in the reservations. And does that mean that they're able to register to vote or not? And so, because of that, for the most part, if you're going to use a tribal ID, you usually have to have another form of identification, which could be a burden, right? Especially if you don't necessarily have the transportation. Other instances that I've seen is, especially for youth of color, right? They're becoming of age. We're seeing that we want them to get involved. But some of these youth, they're part of a mixed status family, right? I can give you, for example, in Texas, where I live, one obstacle that we've identified is that these youth, they tend to go get their identification when they're going to get their driver's license, right? But in order to be able to do your test for your driver's license, you need to have an insured car and then the person that takes you with their driver's license. If your parents are undocumented and are out of status, they don't have that. And so you don't have that equitable access to be able to get that, even though you're a U.S. citizen yourself. So, if for those people that think that it's not a big deal, first off, let's think of the root of why is this implemented, right? The excuse is quote unquote voter fraud. There is no such evidence anywhere, right? It's not addressing any issue. What is creating is obstacles. And if we really care about true representation, then we should be for eliminating as many obstacles and making it as accessible as possible. And then two, if we don't think that it's a big deal, then like you said, right, we check our privilege. That's something that is very real. But maybe even asking within your circle, it's not necessarily a conversation that anybody's going to have with you, because sometimes it could be a little bit stigmatized. Oh, you couldn't get the documents that you needed. It's so easy, right? I can tell you from firsthand experience right now, I'm having to make an amendment to my birth certificate because my mother's name is actually not spelled like in her birth certificate. And I've had a lot of issues. And you're talking about somebody who's been in this field, who is willing to advocate for herself and her community. But these issues are still very real. And it could be, even from not that person's fault to begin with.
It's funny how I went from having a privileged misunderstanding of the importance of ID and how difficult it may be for some people to then going the opposite direction, because I have to admit my home state is Kansas. So I come from the state that is the birthplace of Chris Kobach and his being big on having ID for voting. So then I went the opposite direction and I'm like, why are they asking me questions even when I'm giving them my ID? Like, I don't understand why I have to repeat my address when I have just handed you my ID. And that pisses me off every time I vote. Like, what is the purpose of me giving you my ID? Are you trying to quiz me? Are you trying to trick me? And I can imagine how for someone who has things that they're worried about that I don't worry about, like I don't have a criminal record, I don't have a legal documentation to be in the US issue. Like, I can imagine how that might make me stop if someone was trying to verify my address, right? I know that that's an issue for some people, isn't it? Like, that's maybe why they're funny about going to government offices to get their ID.
Yes, that's very real, right? The we have structural racism to begin with, right? So even starting in the administrative offices to, again, right, maybe at least having the perception of authority, somebody there, right? DMV's ID issuing offices, you know, have transitioned from, providing services to trying to catch somebody in a lie, essentially. And when it comes to polling locations, it could very well be the same, right? From, you know, BIPOC voters being more likely to be asked for an identification or additional questions after providing their identification versus, a white voter. And it could be intimidating. That could be the reason why people are hesitant, and sometimes not even show up at the polls, right? I think that you definitely have to be aware of what your rights are and that you do have the right documentation so you can go vote with confidence. Because we see that sometimes even poll workers may give information or may, go through all their processes when maybe it's not necessary to do that, or maybe it is, right? And so even walking somebody through the process, and then if something deviates from that plan, can cause a red alert. Just briefly to give an example, I took my youngest brother to vote for the first time in the 2022 midterm elections in Texas. And so I made sure that he registered on time. I made sure that he had his full first, middle, all his last names, because I actually had issues with voting in the beginning as well because of, the name discrepancies. And he did so. He sent me a picture. Everything was good to go. And when he went to go vote, when we were outside, I walked him through what was supposed to happen. And when we walked in, all of a sudden, when he provided the driver's license, he was given an additional document where they said, you have to initial saying that you are the same person. And so he turns to look at me. Exactly. He turns to look at me like saying, Selene, what's going on? You didn't tell me about this, right? And so I had to step in. I was like, excuse me, what is it that he's initialing? Everything should be in order. And so then it turned out that it was because his middle name they only had it on file with his initial. And in his license, he has the full middle name, the full name. And I told him, why didn't you do that? And he said, I did do it. And he sent me the picture. So we verified that he actually put it just like it had it in his driver's license. And then the poll worker shared with us and said, sometimes the elections office actually, because they have so many, they'll just shorthand, they'll just put an initial. That's actually happened to me. I had to do that when I voted. I mean, it even happened to the poll worker there. So seeing these things and, thinking back, if I wouldn't have been there, what would have been his reaction, right? Especially because with him, he's a rule follower and he says, hey, if they say no, there must be a reason, they must be right. And so it's just, that's just a small instance of how big of an impact these
It's a
little
small
things can have.
instance, but it's a small instance that repeated often enough can affect election results. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back with more from Selene Gomez. This is Race Unwrapped. Welcome back to Race Unwrapped. Our guest today is Selene Gomez with Vote Writers. You can't really talk about voting and race without talking about voter suppression, right? And when I'm listening to you, even telling the story with your brother, I'm reminded of the stories I read about the poll tax and the literacy test and how, you have to go to these government offices to vote and they put all of these increasingly smaller hoops for you to jump through. Just that on the surface, well, they apply to everybody. So you can't say it's racist because, I'm making other people do this, but it's, disparate impact, right?
Yes, for sure. I mean, I think we've definitely transitioned from the Jim Crow racism into what many scholars now call colorblind racism, right? Where they claim that it's applicable to everybody, but that the effects are going to be disproportional. And voter ID is no exception. I mean, citizens of color are 3.7 times more likely to be without an unexpired license or state identification than a white citizen adult, right? We also know that Black and Latinx Americans are disproportionately less likely to have a current driver's license or even an identification with their current name or address. And so these things are very concerning because while there isn't that explicit right intent, at least written out in these laws, that those are going to be the effects that are going to be taking place. And I think that it's been very apparent because the racial turnout gap has only gotten bigger, right? Since 2008, people say, well, voter turnout is going up. Like, that's a great thing. Yes, but that is also a very deceiving narrative because we're seeing that the gap on voter turnout with voters of color versus white voters is becoming bigger. And so this is something that needs to be addressed. And I'm not trying to correlate it, but I definitely think there's an association of, since about 2008, this has been happening. Voter ID laws started, sweeping the nation in 2012, right? I don't think that is a coincidence. I don't think it's a determining factor, but it could potentially be contributing to it for sure.
Do you see that there are some states or part of the country where the voter ID issue is particularly problematic, or is it just all over?
I think that the fact, even if it's in one state, it's one state too many because it already creates confusion, right? And I think that it's very dangerous. I think there are some states that have very strict laws. There's others that are pretty flexible when it comes to the identifications. But one of the big things to note is, looking at discrepancies on who, for example, who accepts student IDs and who doesn't, right? It's very telling as to what populations are being targeted in which state, depending on what identifications are being used. And then also the reliance of that confusion. Since the last presidential election, 17 states have either changed or implemented a voter ID law, which means that at least in 17 states, whatever a voter may have done in 2020 may not work this time around, right? We have, Ohio, for example, that went from having a very relaxed voter ID law to in early 2023 becoming the strictest, if not one of the most strict voter ID laws in the country. And so we're starting to see this more and more. And unfortunately, we're not seeing these ID laws being changed for the better. Not that they are good to begin with, but at the bare minimum, at least expanding the identifications that are accepted, making sure that we accept all student IDs, things like that. But it's just something that even though you can't say you could, right? There are some more that are strict than others, but just having a voter ID law is creating an additional obstacle for a voter to be able to access the polls and to be able to cast a ballot that counts confidently.
So I see that one of the ways that you help people is that you help people to get to where they need to get their identification, which is pretty big, right? I mean, that's a pretty big deal because for some people, just merely having the transportation to get their ID is an impediment.
Yes, we tend to see that, something very basic like transportation could be an issue. And this became even more of an issue after COVID, right? And COVID, a lot of the ID issuing offices starting to implement appointments and how kind of in a way stuck with them, right? At this point, I can tell you in Texas, in some areas, you have to wait about 3 months to be able to get an appointment to your ID issuing office. So because of that, now there's a very small window where a person can go and get their identification. And if you're relying on, public transportation, whatever it may be, you're also living paycheck to paycheck. So you're trying to, not ask for time off if not needed. That transportation can be the difference between you obtaining your identification or just trying to risk it, go by and saying, well, hopefully I don't need it for anything anytime soon.
Wow. Are there many states that at least allow for provisional voting if you show up and don't have proper ID?
So if you don't have that identification, then you will be given a provisional ballot. So there are states that have alternatives where you can still cast a regular ballot, like I mentioned earlier, like in Texas. where you have the secondary piece of document, you sign the affidavit, you get a regular ballot. But there's others where you would get a provisional ballot, but you still have to go and cure it afterwards, right? You do have that window where you have to go and show up with it afterwards, right? And to be quite honest, the chances of somebody doing that is slim to none, right? Because sometimes fitting it into your schedule to just go vote to begin with,
Right.
already causes, whatever it may be, an inconvenience or whatever it may be. Or sometimes they don't even know, right? Sometimes, like in Texas, when all the 25,000 rejected ballots after the change of the voter ID law on the vote by mail, some may have not known that their ballot was rejected until it was too late.
Yeah, which to me is the scariest thing about all of this, right? Is, I've been voting since I was old enough to vote. So it's been a few decades. And there's just always this assumption that when I vote, my vote is going to count and it's going to, go where it needs to go, that there's not going to be some problem with it. And these last two presidential elections and even the upcoming one are making me double and triple check that I am registered to vote where even though I haven't moved, I want to make sure that everything is as it's supposed to be. Are there any themes that y'all are seeing to the laws that have come up since the last presidential election? Like, is it targeting IDs? Is it targeting absentee voting? What are these new voting bills targeting?
It's kind of across the board, right? In person and by mail. I think that the only theme that we've seen, and I think it has been the thing since it started, is just becoming more and more strict. It's going on the wrong direction. I don't think we've seen states that have have had a voter ID law and maybe been more lenient or expanded. Maybe one or two, but those are exceptions, right? Compared to the 38 out of 50 states that have a voter ID law. And I mean, we see that people of color are a growing population in many of the states. A lot of the states where this is happening, we don't. We see it trending, unfortunately, in the wrong direction.
So, just to wind up this discussion, what do you anticipate seeing in the next few months for you all? How many more people do you think you're going to be having to help to get to November 2024?
So our goal for 2024 is to reach 10 million voters. And I am happy to report that we are definitely on track for that. So we don't have a set number of how many we need to for us, it's if you have a question, if you need an ID, come to us. We encourage people to do this, not, as we get closer to elections, but now, to make sure that you do have what you need to vote. We definitely see that, especially after the study and seeing some of the demographics that are most impacted by voter ID, being more strategic and targeting specific populations. For me, something that was just very striking was that, young Black voters are the least likely to have an acceptable ID that is current. Only between the ages of 18 and 29, only about 70% of Black voters or Black adults have a driver's license or a state ID, and only about half of those have their current name and address on it. So we do anticipate that there is going to be a lot of questions when it comes to voting, right? We also know that Latinx individuals are the most likely to have issues with the ID that they use because of discrepancies. I, myself, am one of them, right? For me, because it didn't have both of my last names, I was actually turned away and said that I couldn't vote when I first became of age to be able to vote. So I definitely see a lot of people coming to us with an urgency. In the back end, I just encourage people to address it sooner rather than later, because we don't want to be getting calls on election day, which we tend to get, right? During early voting election day, people kind of needing to start from scratch and needing to start the process. Of course, we look for alternatives to see if, depending where they live, if they're still able to cast a regular ballot, but then we let them know we're still going to help you get your state identification so that does not become an issue in the
Nice.
So yeah.
So what are the ways that people can contact you, your organization now? What are all the different ways they can contact you if they have any questions or concerns or problems now up until Election Day?
So the different ways that people can contact us is one through our website, votewriters.org. You can go there and then our chat bot pops up on the bottom right. So if you have any questions or you need help in getting an identification, you can go ahead and get started there. We will ask what language you prefer because all of our resources are fully bilingual in English and in Spanish and what state you live in. But after that, you could chat with a live staff member or a trained volunteer. You can also call or text our helpline, which is 866-ID, the number 2, vote. So if you have any questions again, or you need help in getting an ID, know that if you live in a state that has a voter ID law, we cover the cost associated with any underlying documents that you may need to be able to get your identification. You can also look for us on social media, all platforms, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, just with the handle at Vote Writers. And Instagram, you can actually DM us as well if you have any questions or if you're interested in us helping you get an identification. So there's various different ways, again, and I encourage everybody to start thinking about this. Even if you don't have specific questions about yourself, go to votewriters.org. On our homepage, we have a color-coded map. Click on your state. See if you have a voter ID law. Hey, has a voter ID law changed since the last presidential election? Who may benefit from this information? Who is affected by this change? We definitely keep it up to date, so we highly encourage individuals to be active on that.
That's a really good map. I've looked at it, and it's really just fascinating to see how it's color coded because a lot of your assumptions are challenged, right? Like it's like, oh, I would have thought it would have been harder in this state than it would be in this state, but it's like that's why we all got to look up our states, right? Just one last question that you remind me of. Do you know or do you recall about how many calls you all got like on Election Day in November 2020? Like just generally? Because I would imagine it was a lot.
In November 2020, I don't have the statistics for that year. I can tell you that I do have some statistics from 2021 and 2023. In 2023, calls and texts to Vote Writers, our helpline, went up by 79% compared to 2021.
Wow.
Yes. And just to show you the impact, right? You're talking about 2023 when I just mentioned, right, that, for example, Ohio went from a pretty relaxed voter ID law to a strict one. Ohio was 14% of those calls, which went up from 2021. So, yeah, just to give it some perspective a little bit there. And we also know that from last year, our helpline has gone up about 287% compared to 2021. I just wanted to point out also in regards to just how big of an issue, or is it really an issue? Something that I like to share is that, you know, after our study, we found that about 14.8% of individuals don't have a current driver's license with their name and address on it. That translates to over 34.5 million voting age adults.
That's a lot.
Exactly.
That was Selene Gomez with Vote Writers, a national organization that's helped millions of people get the ID they need to vote. Next up on Race Unwrapped, we'll talk to Nicole Porter with the Sentencing Project about the millions of American citizens who lose their voting rights because of criminal felony convictions. I'm Michelle Tyreen Johnson, and this is Race Unwrapped.
Race Unwrapped is produced by Michelle Tyreen Johnson for Louisville Public Media. Alex Biscardi is our audio engineer. Music by Allison Cross. Our executive producer is Laura Ellis. For more information, to contact us, or to support Race Unwrapped, visit raceunwrapped.org.
Support comes from Vision Zero. On foot or behind the wheel, safety is a shared responsibility. And Vision Zero Louisville believes 0 roadway fatalities is the only acceptable amount. Their mission is to create safe roads by design, engineering solutions, and education. More information at visionzerolouisville.org.